Jolly good. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you everybody for coming. Data Orchard is a social enterprise. We're based in the West Midlands, but we work all over the UK. And we specialise in helping other organisations to get better with data. So I'm not going to talk to you today about coding specifically, but I do hope to offer something that's going to be quite interesting or useful, and useful even, especially if you've struggled to engage leaders or colleagues in the joy of data. So I'm going to start with a bit of context. Which is not-for-profit sector. You'll see from the event title that we specialise in the not-for-profit sector. For those of you who are not familiar with the not-for-profit sector, it's actually quite complex. Do talk to people about data on legal types of non-profit organisations. So some people think it's just charities, but in fact, it's quite a complex range of organisations. So you can see in this slide here, this triangle kind of describes the range of different kinds of organisations and this link between whether they're for-profit or non-profit, whether they're formal or informal, and whether they're public or private. So that comes from NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations in England and Wales. Data Orchard sits in here in this little bubble that's called a KIC. We're a community interest company, which essentially means we're part of a small but excitingly growing tribe of organisations that are not for profit, but we do trade for social impact, and we're very proud and excited about that growing sector. We also include in our definition of the not-for-profit sector the public sector, so we also work with local authorities. We've been working with Scottish Government, Welsh Government and various UK departments. For fullness of context, though, I know many of you are based or have been based in Scotland, so this is from SCVO, Scottish Voluntary Sector Organisations, overview. So you just get a feel of, there's quite a variety of organisations by size. They're part of the economy and employ people and deliver all kinds of services and products. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a potted history of Data Orchard's research and development of tools and resources in data maturity. And just as a sort of background, back in 2010 was what we're calling our epiphany, really, which was a really exciting time, and many of you may have remembered it. Where there was all the fanfare about big data. Suddenly more data was available than ever before. There were new analytics tools, and for us, some real heroes like Hans Rosling were doing TED Talks about global poverty and income inequality, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, based up in the Northeast, were publishing their first sort of interactive visualizations around poverty in the UK. Data Orchard ourselves, we set up as a social enterprise in 2013, and in 2015 we started researching data maturity models, and we were doing this in partnership with DataKind UK, which were also a charity that had set up around the same time, and we were really interested in how organisations get better with data, and we started looking at what was already out there, of which there was plenty, mostly from the commercial sector and mostly aimed at very large corporate organisations, and we found none of it was really appropriate for the sector that we worked in, and so we built our own, essentially. And in doing that, we did some research with the not-for-profit sector itself, so we did lots of under the bonnet, looking at organisations and what they were doing and how they were working with data. And in 2017, we published our first framework, our first sort of model for how organisations get better with data. And in fact, it was at that time that Mike got in touch to say, hey, this is great. And we were really chuffed to hear that. So thank you, Mike. And a lot has happened since 2017. So the following year, we launched it at the first Data for Good conference and brought a whole group of partners together nationally of organisations who were themselves in the not-for-profit sector and all interested in building the capacity of the sector. In 2019, we launched our first online tool. So this is an online questionnaire that enables organisations to assess how they're doing with data. And shortly after that, we launched an even more advanced version that's a customizable version of it. And we started looking at our impact to find out how the tool had been used and what value it had brought to organisations. And here we are. In 2021, we're about to launch the first report on what the data tells us about the organisations that have used our tool. So that's potted history and a bit of context. I'm sure lots of you are wondering what on earth data maturity is. So without further ado, this is the basic structure of our data maturity framework, where essentially it describes an organisation's journey along these 5 stages from unaware through emerging, learning, developing and mastery. And it also describes these 7 themes. So of the 7 themes, 2 of them are quite kind of practical. Obviously, you have to have data and you have to have tools. A couple of them are very much about purpose, so the purposes for which you're using the data, the ways and purposes in which you're analysing it. But ever such a lot of it is about people. So leadership and culture and skills are all absolutely crucial. So we designed our data maturity assessment as a set of questions really around those 7 themes. And you can see for each theme, there are a set of sub-themes. And essentially people can go online and they can take the questionnaire and they will get their own report. So it sits within the context of a process that the organisation goes through. So the process is really about how you engage the organisation. The output will be a report about where you are on that data maturity journey and how you compare with others. But ultimately, it's about a first step towards creating some kind of plan or strategy about how you're going to progress. So this is an example of the report that gets generated. So in this case, you can see this this person scored the organisation, 1.8 out of 5. They weren't doing very well at all, this organisation. They're emerging. And then you can drill into each of the 7 themes in the report and invite colleagues. And our premium version kind of makes it easier to do that. And then looking in depth at the skills, for example, it says how you scored. It compares you to the benchmark group. It tells you really where we think you are on the journey for that theme and what the next stage might look like. So it just helps people to identify, where they're strongest, where they're weakest, and how to support them really in those conversations about how they're going to get better. So just to talk you through, we've just been doing the analysis on the first batch, well, actually the first several batches of data from when we launched in 2019 to the end of last year. And we had about 2,000 responses. The tool is very much about encouraging multiple people to take the assessment and drive conversations. So we had to clean and match those individual respondents to organisations, and then there was a validation process. So of course, anyone who completed it with a personal email address, we couldn't validate that they were a genuine non-profit organisation. And then we had to exclude the commercial organisations, and there's a little bit of a taster and a full assessment. So anyway, Basically, there are 249 validated organisations in our research, but mostly we focus on the 133 who have completed the full assessment. So what kinds of organisations are using it? We're quite fascinated by this, although it was primarily aimed at the non-profits, the blues kind of non-governmental organisations. We found it was used quite a lot by public sector organisations and also by commercial ones. And they're quite a range in terms of their, their size and turnover as well. And you can see they also operate in quite a range of areas that from social services and health, which are quite big. Education also is quite a big non-profit activity area. But there are also grant makers, all different kinds of government organisations and culture, religion, all sorts really. So it's quite a mixed bag in there. So essentially, based on those 133 organisations, this is what the data was showing about where it's at overall on that journey. And unsurprisingly, most of them are at the learning stage, but an encouraging number are also at the developing stage as well. And when it comes to strengths and weaknesses, the weakest areas are skills and leadership and analysis. And the strongest areas are in data and culture. Much difference between the sector, not very much from the numbers that we've seen. So this is based on the 249 across all sectors. So essentially everybody seems to be learning, whatever their sector, but there's a huge amount of variety within it. So some are really leading the way and some are really lagging behind. Now, I wanted to explain, this might be useful to those of you who are thinking, what's the point of this and what use is it? We've identified kind of three main groups of people who are using our tool. There are organisational leaders who mostly think that their organisation needs to get better with data, but they just don't know where to start. There are the data strategists who are kind of given the role of leading on data in their organisation, who are really frustrated because they don't really have a way of engaging their leaders and colleagues in thinking about or talking about data. And there's also the data champions as well, and they're often quite frustrated people who are really doing the data and they maybe don't have the ear of senior leadership to have an influence, but they are kind of seeing the potential of it and quite frustrated. And overall, many of them, they just don't know. It's quite a new field. I think although data's been around forever, I would say it's only really been in the last decade that there's been this absolute revolutionary transformation in data and analytics. And so for a lot of people for whom it's not their specialism, knowing what good looks like or what great looks like is outside of their realms of experience. And they don't really know how they're doing compared to others. So the idea is people with those problems, they take our data maturity assessment, which provides them with immediate benefits. Our impact report shows the biggest impact of the tool is that it's about learning. So it helps organisations to develop a shared understanding about what's important and what questions they need to be thinking about in terms of their organisation's data maturity. It also gives that objective view of where they're at now and a sort of baseline from which to spring forward. And it's also about raising aspirations. So in a way, by seeing what's possible through answering the questions in a way, and seeing what the framework's offering, they're getting a kind of a step-by-step approach to improving. So that's kind of like at the point people have finished the assessment, and that's kind of where we mostly draw the line in terms of our accountability. But what we're really excited about is the longer term impact. So most of the those who have used the tool have told us that they've gone on to then have discussions with their colleagues about how to get better. They've developed some kind of plan, secured leadership support, sought resources, and then they go on to implement those. And often it means people moving into new jobs or creating new jobs or investment in training or skills or tools, for example. But ultimately is, of course, the rewards and benefits, because after a period of time, when those plans have been implemented, then the organisation starts to see the rewards, which are obviously around their improved knowledge and expertise, better strategic decision making and planning, services and products are improving, there's greater efficiencies, and that also we're really excited to see a lot of data sharing and collaboration around data with other organisations, which is about a shared understanding and influence and credibility for what they're doing. So that's a whistle-stop through our theory of change. So just some of the ways in which the assessment can be used. Obviously, we can use it for sector benchmarking, and that's what we're doing right now. The more advanced, sophisticated tool has an opportunity for organisations to do internal benchmarking. So in very large organisations, which might be dispersed or operating in different countries or different departments, it allows you to identify perhaps where the leaders and laggers might be within your own organisation and start those conversations. We do bespoke benchmarking. So if you're only interested in finding out how if you're a housing organisation and you want to find out how you're comparing to other housing organisations, we can zone in on that sector. Repeat assessments are what I think is one of the most exciting things, and we've used this with our own clients. I'll talk about that in a moment. And cohort assessments and reassessments. So I'm just going to talk about those last two in a little bit more detail, just because this is an organisation that is a cancer support charity. We're just about to do their fourth, can you believe it, their fourth data maturity assessment. But Data Orchard worked with them, started working with them in June 2018. So we did, the blue line represents how they scored as a baseline data maturity assessment. And the green line represents how they were doing at the end of a year of support. It was quite light touch support. We were testing out what kind of support is needed to help organisations progress. And you can see in that time there was some progress. Interestingly, the users reduced, but at the same time as the skills increased. So I think there was an assumption that they were perhaps using data for things that they actually weren't. But what's really exciting is the pink line, because as any consultant will tell you, it takes some time for an organisation to implement recommendations and implement change in their organisation. So we were really pleased a year later to see that they were really continuing on that trajectory towards data maturity. And the last example I wanted to give was cohort assessment. So I mean, Data Orchard is quite a small specialist organisation. We probably work with maybe 20 or 30 clients a year. As you can see from the sector scale and size, it's a huge sector. The challenge of moving the whole sector forward is absolutely huge, and there's no way that we would intend to do that ourselves. And we in fact see ourselves as part of an ecology of organisations who help other organisations to get better with data. So we've been testing out how our tool can help those organisations. One of those organisations is Superhighways, who are running a programme called DataWise in London, and they're working with 7 small charities on a programme of support and mentoring around their data maturity. So we did a data maturity assessment for all 7 of those organisations back in last September, and they are currently finishing their post-support assessments, which we will be presenting tomorrow, in fact, so quite a lot of data analysis to do later today. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation, only to just share with you if you'd like to join our mailing list, please do. We try and share and promote good practice, and that includes sharing information and resources and what we're learning. Do go and take a free data maturity assessment. There's a free version available, and you can do a quick 5-minute taster, or you can do the full 20-minute assessment. If you're interested in our kind of agency or partner version, do come and approach us. We'll be happy to talk you through that. And we've got all kinds of data maturity resources. So we're trying to build up a kind of bank of case studies and advice and tips for organisations to support them to improve their data maturity. There we go. That's the end of my presentation. I'd be really interested to hear people's views and to take questions and have a chat about it, really.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sian. I'm sure there's some virtual applause going on in the background somewhere. Okay, so we've had some questions through already, and I am keeping an eye on them for when more arrive. So we'd start with Nick was asking sort of a big picture question, and it's maybe, he's saying maybe just his misunderstanding, but when you're talking about data, what do you mean? Is it talking about data the organisation holds on its staff, or that it holds on customers or on other people, or is it sort of non-people based data? Or
well, it's everything, really. We take a really holistic view to data. So in our book, it means everything. It means all of your files, all of your documents. It can mean maps. It can be photos, videos, social media, emails, whatever. And it is everything. So it can be about your customers or your clients. We've honed the language a little bit. We're now going with clients, but people call it everything. It's beneficiaries is quite common in the charity sector. Some people call them customers. Sometimes it's residents. Sometimes it's students. So all of those we bag together as the people that you work with. It can also be your staff, and by staff it can be your employees, but it could also be volunteers. So there's lots and lots of volunteers all over the non-profit sector, as you can imagine. But it could be your board members, it could be your other stakeholders, so partners, funders, for example. And in terms of the kind of data, it can range from data about what you do, about who you engage with, about the quality of your services. It could be data about your impact, all of that. It could be performance data. So it's taking a really huge look at it, and it can be quite overwhelming, which is why we try and break it down and simplify it. But I think if you're thinking strategically about data in your organization, you have to take the whole kind of big picture of it. I should add, when you say about clients as well, we've come up against this issue where some organizations don't serve people at all. So, if you're a puffin counter, puffin protection person who does animals, quite a lot of the sector actually, are about animals or the environment. So they're more about habitats and places. So we're kind of honing our wording to say, think in those terms when you complete it and see the word clients, but
Public Health Scotland put out a new digital strategy about 2 weeks ago, and they've very particularly gone for the word users, and then kind of describe that as policy or public, or but I completely agree with you. It's very different things for very different people, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been, we've tried really hard to make it as generic as possible, understanding that the sector and what it does is incredibly diverse. So
we have a question from Greg that he also thinks you might have answered, but I'll go anyway. Is one thing this week is getting buy-in from senior management for changes towards better use of data and tools. Other than hire Data Orchard, do you have any steps that you've seen work?
Well, one of the things is, other organisations using our tool, either the free version or, come and use the paid version and you lead on it. That's something that we're very keen to promote. I mean, I think there's a real issue, and we'll see this in the report that's coming out soon, which is that the majority of leaders don't really see the value of data in their organisation. And to some extent, is explainable because a lot of the data quality is really poor. So when we start, one of the areas that we look at in data, so, it's kind of, in some respects, hardly surprising that there's a lack of confidence in it. And I think it's also about lack of skills. So there's a real problem in leadership about having skilled people in there. And I think the real challenge of, if you're a data person talking to a non-data person, I think communication and making leaders feel comfortable with it is really important. So it depends on the motivation. If often the leaders that are coming to us are people who have, they get 200 performance indicators delivered in incomprehensible reports to them every quarter. And they're completely baffled by them. So I think engaging leadership in collecting the right data is the real crux. And I suppose this is where showing by example is really helpful. If leaders can see another organisation in the context that they're working that are doing really well, then they can kind of get it around what it's supposed to be or what good practice could be. But for a lot of people, it is completely outside their realms and it's relatively new.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, in my experience, I suppose it's this difference between an opinionated decision and an informed decision. And if you're very used to doing the former, the second can feel like a loss of control, or
I mean, we've worked really hard at the language in the tool to try and make it as accessible to people as possible. So it's very much not aimed at technical audiences, but aimed at actually what's the behaviour, what's going to be actually effective in your organisation.
And I've got a question on sort of when I've filled it in the past. How I've always wondered, how honest do you think people are in appraising themselves? And I suppose there's this question then around unknown unknowns, that if you've got no frame of reference for what you are completing, you might believe you are doing something well, and in fact you are copying and pasting between spreadsheets. Which, sort of, I mean, that was the reason I learned to program, was that copying and pasting between spreadsheets was a complete waste of my time. But you might believe you're doing something well if you don't know any better.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of points actually on that. I think one of them is that we've always designed this tool with a view to getting multiple perspectives. And it's really important that more than one person talks about this. And this is where I find it really exciting in our kind of customized version, because it makes it much easier for people to get their own individual perspective, but for bringing all of those perspectives together into an organization overview. And, what that shows when you're doing the analysis is where there's a lot of diversity of opinion on things, and that's the conversation starter, or when there's a lot of consensus of opinion. And absolutely on the don't knows, the idea, not everybody is going to know everything about data in your organization, which is why it's great to ask lots of people. And then there's the question of like, well, why did everyone say they didn't know this? Surely somebody knows the answer to this. And so you can start to pick up on, what doesn't the organization know that it really should know? So that's one thing. And another point that I wanted to come back to actually was just on the engaging leaders, picking up on your point about cutting and pasting data, because one of the questions in the assessment is about whether people are doing things manually or automated or semi bit of each. And our experience is like there's just huge amounts of people's time being spent working on data that is hidden. And in fact, we ask people in the assessment how much of their job is about working with data. And consistently, it's about 40 to 50% in any organization. It's a lot, people don't really believe it, but you talk to the administrators, you'll find that they're doing like 90% of their time. And when I see organizations who are putting together their quarterly performance reports for the board, or putting data together for their contracts and funders, or regulators. It's a huge amount of existing staff time and actually resource. It's probably in our sector, probably the biggest expense is on staff employee costs. So if you're spending 40 to 50% of your existing staff bill already on data and not gaining the fruition and the benefits of it, that's kind of pretty criminal, really. So that is often a wake-up call for leaders when they see how much they're already spending and not
Okay, fantastic.
really
Conrad,
seeing the rewards.
Did you have a question?
Yes. Yeah. No, just wanted to kind of, follow up on that point in terms of, people pasting things across spreadsheets. So I think it's a very topical subject. I work as a senior manager at Virgin Money, and before that I used to work in a consultancy, and I have seen that a lot in terms of just, the whole processes that are running for years, in effect rely on people just doing some kind of, manual ETL steps in terms of, exporting data from some database, then pasting into a spreadsheet, then, importing that into SAS, then running some SAS process, then pasting a chart into a PowerPoint and so on. I very much share this kind of point in terms of just a huge amount of human effort and intelligence being wasted on those kind of repetitive, I would say, manual steps that are also very error prone. So it's very easy for someone to paste something in a wrong cell or whatever, and that then takes a lot of time for people to kind of investigate and fix and so on. So you have this, I would say, a dual loss of time. So not only the process, but the whole kind of, quality assurance and the validation, follow-up activity after that. And what I wanted to ask is just in terms of, strategies of engaging people who do that and just changing those things, like, what would you recommend? Because I think it's quite difficult if you have teams that maybe spend their whole, working life in Excel and VBA. It's quite difficult just to approach that kind of team and say, oh, you should start programming in Python, or you should switch to, doing this in R. So I think there is one challenge there in terms of, potentially kind of I would say a training requirement those people might have. And also there is this trade unionist perspective, at times, the whole nature of a job for some unit somewhere might be just extracting things out of the database. So you have this, in bigger organizations, you might encounter this trade unionist perspective a little bit, that you have basically teams that pull things out of databases and they disseminate through Microsoft Office artifacts. So just a generic question from myself, like, what are good strategies in terms of changing that from your experience in working with different organizations?
I would say it's different in every organization, and the problems are different in every organization. So it's hard to set out a specific sort of generic strategy. I think I would say the emphasis is depends on what's the priority for the organization. So some, for example, are sometimes they're just their motivation is that they've got legacy systems that are about to keel over. They're just like, oh my gosh, we need a new tool to put all of our data into. I suppose my purist hat would say the place to start is by working out what kind of impact you want to have as an organization, and to make sure that you're collecting, what data you want to get out of whatever it is that you're doing. And sometimes that is about, understanding performance. We've had it in organizations who care about their equality and diversity data, and that's the place they're starting in their organization. Sometimes it's in a particular service that is really struggling. And it can, I think it just depends on the priority of the organization. I see it in its kind of purest form as being part of the strategy, where you look at all of those 7 areas. You look at the ones that you're weakest in, you start conversations in the organization. And it's really the process, when I talk about data maturity, is about engaging the people in the organization in the conversations about what they need to do. And it's about bringing those diverse people, you know, from the senior to the front line across different teams and departments, because particularly in larger organizations it can get quite siloed into specific projects or, you know, systems for the particular area of the organization. So that diversity of voice and the whole organization thinking, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Really good answer. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Thanks very much, Sian. And yeah, that was, I think we haven't got any more questions. So yeah, sort of once more, virtual round of applause for Sian, and feel free to join us in the Matrix room later, where I'm sure there'll be more discussion. I have a few slides now, which are rounding up the week. Then I'm going to hand over to Greg to talk about what's happening tomorrow. So hopefully I shall share my screen. Okay, so I thought I'd round up the week for the things we've been talking about, and a quick highlight of, I suppose, what's been going on and the personal take-homes for me. So first of all, as we've mentioned lots of times, the organisers have been a collaboration between Edinburgh and PyData Edinburgh. We're both on Twitter, we both have presence on Meetup, so follow both of those organisations to find things that are going on, obviously within the Edinburgh and broader Scotland area, but also more globally, as we're putting our talks on YouTube, and you know, in a virtual world, it's easy for us to share things. Our speakers this week have been David, Kirsty, John, Arvon, Hilary, Sava, and Sian, and they have all been amazing. They've brought so many different perspectives to things that touch on all of our work and challenges that we face. I've certainly, found myself reframing questions in a way I want to challenge things based on what they've spoken about, and I suppose that's bringing it back around to this kind of corporate ideas of continuing professional development and things like that. They're the things that we need to be thinking about. How do we save time? How do we make our lives more enjoyable and pleasant when we're at work? And I think I've definitely picked up something from all of those speakers, and please give them a follow on Twitter. So as a quick roundup, I thought we'd start with Kirsty and her statement. I think this resonated for Greg and I, and probably lots of others, was that I care. Kirsty said this very vehemently in the talk. It's like, I care whether things are getting better or not. It matters to me in my work and the way that I interact with others, that actually I want a better society for all. And I think that was a hugely important. And Sava talked about how his organisation was doing this as a business, how they were, essentially making money to pay their salaries, but also putting projects together for the wider community. So this is just a highlight of some of the things that Lutra Consulting are working on with their clients' money, but then releasing openly for the broader world to use and enjoy, which is a fantastic model for us all. And this way of working is built on Git, and this has been, for me, the biggest thread running through the whole week. Is actually, if we're working openly, what that means is that we need a way of working together, or to put that another way, if we want to work with other people, we have to do it openly. And the best way we can do this, if it involves code, is by using Git. So there's some great tips and things within the Turing way that Kirsty talked about. And then if we jump onto the next slide, John talked about this very particularly with the British Geological Survey, in that actually Git training underpinned all of their move to openness. Without staff being able to use Git, they couldn't work with other people. They were operating in their own silo of one, perhaps even to the point of not being able to operate or work with their future selves. So having that version control with Git just makes life easier for yourself and for everyone around you. And one of the ways that the BGS had tackled this, and we saw it again with Public Health Scotland and David, was that that John had talked about pair programming, and David was talking about buddy up programming, where maybe you take two people who've got similar levels, or maybe you take someone who's more experienced, and you get them to work together on a project so that they are working alongside each other and can comment on what is going on. Maybe one does the thinking, one does the typing, and that's a a really great way to share knowledge and help bring people up to speed really quickly, which Hilary really rounded out for us as actually, when you then start scaling this up, it becomes a community. That it's not just two people helping each other. When we start looking at, say, this event this week, and we've, over the course of the week, had potentially 150 or so folk tuning in over different days, and all of those mixing together, that's the community. And we need to find ways of scaling to work with them and finding things that fit and support each other, and that could be within your organization, or it could be more broadly within a wider peer network. And as Arvan pointed out, which is perhaps not a surprise given it's his employer, but GitHub is the biggest peer review platform in the world. So he was talking about how we formalize then this idea of working openly, and that we could take this pair programming and review, and we could do it on a mass scale and find a way to share more sustainable software that works better in more contexts. And so his work there at the Journal of Open Source Software, I think, was hugely interesting. And I think not just for those working in academia, even though that's where it's targeted, but this idea of actually saying, well, maybe we can formalize our releases, that it could be used more broadly. We could get extra pairs of eyes on our code and find ways to improve it for ourselves and for others. I took a bit of a guess here as I made these yesterday about what Sian would talk about, but it was inevitably going to be the data maturity framework. And I think for me, it really ties all of these things together, these ideas of culture and community, of the tools we're using, of how we work openly. And it's only by improving all of these different things, from leadership to uses to analysis, that we actually move on. There's no point going out and buying or building the best analytical platform in the world if you haven't got leaders who can understand and use what comes out of it, or staff who can interact with it, or you don't have a culture which embeds the knowledge coming out of that for the next steps. So this is on GitHub, and Greg or I will drop a link in Matrix and in the Blue Jeans chat, so you can click on all of these and get to all of the talks we've had this week. And our organisers this week have been Sam, Martina and Nick from PyData Edinburgh. We've got Federico, Greg and myself from Edinburgh R. And yeah, we've sort of all worked together and done various bits and bobs along the way. And we are always looking for speakers, both of our groups. It's, definitely, if you have a topic you would like to talk about, please get in touch. If you have a topic you wonder if people might be interested in, please get in touch, and we are happy to discuss all options. And yeah, thank you very much, and we shall see you next time.